Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're exploring, well, a really pivotal area of the global energy transition, India's ambitious push into green hydrogen. We're going to pull apart a comprehensive report on this sector, really drill down into its growth drivers, the policy landscape,
hmm
a full value chain, who the key players are, the economics, and of course the big risks and opportunities. India's aiming for global leadership here, and we want to explore what that actually means for you. All right, let's dive right into this then. India is clearly making a huge bet here, positioning itself as a global leader in green hydrogen. What does that ambitious target actually look like on the ground?
Well, the target is incredibly significant. We're talking 5 million tons per annum, that's MTPA, of green hydrogen production by 2030, all under the umbrella of their national green hydrogen mission.
Okay, 5 MTPA by 2030. And what are the main goals behind that number?
The core aims are really twofold.
Yeah.
First, to significantly decarbonize key industries within India. Think steel, fertilizers, refining.
Right, the hard-to-abate sectors.
Exactly. And second, to drastically cut down the reliance on imported traditional fuels. Energy security is a big piece.
And is there serious money behind this? Or is it mostly aspirational targets?
Oh, no, this isn't just talk. There's a substantial financial commitment. About 17,490 crore, which is roughly, what, over $2 billion?
Yeah, around that.
Dedicated specifically to building capacity, funding R&D, and various incentives to get projects off the ground.
So green hydrogen sounds like the ideal solution, the future even. But is it cost competitive right now? Today?
Currently, no, not quite. The cost is around $6 per kilogram.
$6. And how does that compare?
Well, to put that in perspective for you, that's noticeably higher than both gray hydrogen.
Which is the standard fossil fuel-based one.
Correct. Made from natural gas, typically, with no carbon capture. And it's also higher than blue hydrogen, which uses fossil fuels but does capture some of the CO2 emissions.
Okay, so there's a cost gap to close.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that cost gap is precisely what India is aggressively working on. The pathway to cost parity to making green hydrogen competitive is clearly laid out. It relies on a combination of strong policy support, continuous technological advancements, better electrolyzers, and really focused localization efforts within India,
Yeah.
bringing that manufacturing home.
And what about the market size? If they get this right, how big could it be?
The projections are, frankly, pretty staggering. Just the Indian electrolyzer market alone, remember, those are the devices that split water that's projected to reach $31 billion by 2050.
$31 billion just for electrolyzers.
It's just for electrolyzers in India. And the broader green hydrogen market in India could potentially grow to a massive $340 billion by that same year, 2050.
Wow. Okay, how does that compare globally?
Good question. So globally, the market's projected to grow from about $2.5 billion this year, 2024, to maybe $16.6 billion by 2029. That's a compound annual growth rate, a CAGR of around 44%. Pretty fast.
Very fast.
But India's projected growth, if these forecasts hold, is even more dramatic. From around $8 billion in 2030, scaling up to that $340 billion figure by 2050.
That's scale. It's almost hard to comprehend. $340 billion.
It really is. That projection isn't just a number. It implies a transformation of entire industrial sectors. You could almost compare it in scale to the IT revolution India experienced, fundamentally reshaping energy security and industrial capability.
And the electrolyzer piece specifically.
Right. Within that huge number, the Indian electrolyzer segment itself is forecast to hit about $4.6 billion by 2030.
Okay.
And then scale from around $4 billion in 2030 up to $78 billion by 2050. That implies a TAGR of about 16% just for that segment.
Those are indeed staggering growth projections pointing to an immense opportunity. But what's the biggest if embedded in those numbers? What absolutely has to go right for India to hit them? And maybe, what's the most common skepticism you hear from investors looking at this?
Well, the biggest if is definitely getting those costs down rapidly. That 6 kilograms needs to fall significantly. And the skepticism often revolves around the speed of infrastructure, build out pipelines, storage, and securing firm long-term demand commitments from industry.
Makes sense. So for our listeners, what are the most compelling investment implications here, given that ambitious outlook, but also those ifs?
Despite the challenges, the sector presents a very compelling long-term investment case. It's really driven by three main things. That strong government backing we talked about,
Right.
increasing industrial demand, especially from those hard-to-abate sectors, and a clear roadmap, or at least a planned roadmap, for cost reduction.
So where should investors focus their attention?
The focus should probably be on companies across the full hydrogen value chain. particularly those involved in electrolyzer manufacturing. That's key. Also, project EPCs, engineering, procurement, and construction firms. These are the folks who actually build the large-scale green hydrogen plants.
The builders.
Exactly. And then, of course, companies involved in the crucial end-use applications. Refineries, fertilizer plants, steel makers adopting the technology.
And within those groups, any specific characteristics to look for?
I'd say early movers, companies already establishing projects and partnerships, and those with strong R&D capabilities. Particularly R&D focused on cost-efficient technologies and, crucially, supply chain localization are likely to benefit the most as this market matures.
Okay, let's shift slightly. Beyond the sheer ambition and the government push, what are the fundamental forces actually driving this demand for green hydrogen in India? Why now?
The primary drivers are very clear, and they align globally, really. First, it's the broader global energy transition. Everyone's looking for decarbonization pathways. Second, India has its own specific national decarbonization goals it needs to meet. And third, as we touched on, there's a strong strategic need to significantly cut down reliance on imported fossil fuels, improve that energy independence.
And what makes green hydrogen the preferred choice over, say, just more renewables or other options?
Its unique selling proposition is really its zero-emission footprint across the production process, assuming the electricity used is renewable.
Right, the green part.
Exactly. That fundamentally distinguishes it from the more carbon-intensive traditional hydrogen production methods, like gray hydrogen from natural gas. It offers a clean fuel and a clean feedstock.
You mentioned refining, fertilizers, steel. Are those expected to be the biggest consumers? Where will the demand really come from initially?
Yes, those are the big three expected to drive initial large-scale demand. We're already seeing early examples nearing commercial viability. Things like green ammonia production ammonia being key for fertilizers.
And easier to transport than pure hydrogen sometimes.
Right. Much easier. Also, what's known as direct reduced iron or DRI-based steelmaking. This is potentially a huge game changer because it aims to replace coal with green hydrogen in steel production.
A notoriously difficult sector to decarbonize.
Extremely difficult.
Yeah.
So that's a major focus. We're also seeing pilot projects for blending hydrogen into existing natural gas networks.
Can you quantify that potential demand?
Some estimates suggest refineries alone could generate demand for about 2.7 to 3 million metric tons of green hydrogen, and green ammonia adoption could drive another, say, 3.75 to 4.25 million metric tons, maybe between FY27 and FY30.
So significant volumes relatively soon.
Potentially, yes. And beyond those, the power sector is also exploring hydrogen co-firing in thermal plants, basically burning hydrogen alongside coal or gas to reduce emissions.
It's clear where the demand could come from, with these hard-to-abate sectors leading the charge. But for all this ambition to translate into reality, the economics have to work. That cost piece is critical.
So let's pivot back to one of the most crucial elements. How quickly are these costs actually expected to come down from that 6-kilogram mark?
Right, back to the cost curve. As we said, current production cost is around $6 per kilogram. The levelized cost of hydrogen, or LCOH, which is a sort of lifetime average cost, was estimated around $3.74 per kilogram in 2023.
Okay, so already a bit lower on a levelized basis. Yes, but still needs to fall further. The projected cost curve shows a pretty significant downward trend, though. The LCOH is projected to fall to approximately $2.01 per kilogram by 2030.
$2.10. That feels like a threshold where it gets really competitive.
It really does. That's seen as a key target. And this reduction isn't magic. It's expected to be driven by efficiency improvements in the electrolyzers.
Getting more hydrogen per unit of electricity.
Precisely. Also, increased localization of manufacturing, bringing down component costs, and, of course, continued government incentives and support playing a role.
And you mentioned electrolyzers are a big part of the cost.
Yes, a very significant part. Electrolyzer costs can account for anywhere from 30 to 50% of the total hydrogen production cost.
Wow, up to half.
Potentially. So the fact that these electrolyzer costs are specifically expected to decline, maybe even exponentially, is a huge factor in reaching that $2.01 target.
So the electrolyzer tech itself is key.
It is, but what's fascinating here, and maybe underappreciated, is that the real game changer for green hydrogen economics isn't just the electrolyzer. It's securing vast amounts of cheap, abundant, renewable energy to power those electrolyzers.
Ah, right. Because the main input is electricity.
Exactly. Renewable energy cost is the single biggest driver. That actually puts countries with strong solar and wind resources, like India, at a distinct strategic advantage if they can harness it effectively.
That makes perfect sense. Cheap sun and wind equals potentially cheap green hydrogen.
Okay, this kind of ambition, this national mission, clearly doesn't happen without serious policy backing.
Hmm.
What's the core of India's strategic blueprint? You mentioned the National Green Hydrogen Mission.
That mission is absolutely central. It sets the vision. It reiterates that 5 MTPA production target by 2030. And it frames the broader goals, mitigating 50 million tons of CO2 annually.
Which is substantial.
Very. And reducing energy imports by a staggering euro trillion. That's over $12 billion saved, potentially.
And backed by that funding you mentioned earlier. Yes, backed by that initial 17,490 crore financial commitment. But the support takes various forms beyond just direct funding. We're seeing direct subsidies for production, production-linked incentive schemes, PLI schemes, which are designed to boost domestic manufacturing of things like electrolyzers.
Right, internalizing production.
Exactly. And also CapEx support, helping companies with the large upfront capital expenditures needed to build these facilities.
Is this all happening at the national level, or are states involved too?
It's definitely not just the central government. Several Indian states have introduced their own complementary green hydrogen policies. States like Punjab, Haryana, Rajasthan, which has huge solar potential, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, Odisha, Andhra Pradesh, many are getting involved.
So a multi-level government push.
Yes. And just as one specific example, there's the Strategic Interventions for Green Hydrogen Transition Program. They call it CUT. That program has already allocated around $259 million in subsidies to 9 successful bidders for green hydrogen production projects. So tangible support is flowing.
So pulling this together, what does all this comprehensive policy and financial commitment signal to long-term investors looking at India?
It signals, I think, a relatively clear policy framework and serious financial commitments. That translates into stronger long-term regulatory visibility, which is absolutely crucial for making multi-billion-dollar investment decisions.
Reduces the risk profile.
Significantly. It helps de-risk these large, long-term projects. And looking ahead, key policy levers will be essential to keep the momentum going. Things like potential carbon pricing mechanisms, direct procurement mandates, maybe requiring certain industries to use a percentage of green hydrogen.
Forcing the demand side a bit.
Potentially, yes. And continued support for accelerated R&D will all be critical in achieving that all-important cost parity we keep coming back to.
Okay, let's trace the journey now. From making the green hydrogen to actually using it. What does this full-stack value chain look like in India? How is it developing?
The value chain that's developing is quite comprehensive. It really covers 3 key segments: electrolyzer manufacturing itself, then the actual green hydrogen production facilities, and finally the necessary offtake, infrastructure storage, transport, getting it to the end user.
Can you break that down further? Upstream, downstream?
Sure. You can think of it as upstream, that's the hydrogen production itself and manufacturing the components like electrolyzers. Then midstream. This is all about storage, transportation, and distribution. How do you move it?
It sounds like a challenge.
It is a challenge. And then downstream. This covers the end users and their specific applications, the refineries, the steel plants, the chemical producers.
And are companies specializing or trying to do it all?
What's interesting is that we're seeing companies establishing capabilities across all 3 segments. A very integrated approach from some major players.
Vertically integrating.
Exactly. This creates significant opportunities for synergy, particularly across those key industrial applications. Think steel production using DRI, oil refineries using it for hydrotreating and hydrocracking.
Those are refining processes.
Yes, essential processes for cleaning up fuels and making higher value products, and also in the chemical industry for making ammonia and methanol using green hydrogen as a feedstock.
You flagged the midstream storage and transport as a challenge. It sounds like getting hydrogen to where it needs to go might be a critical bottleneck. Is that the case?
You're absolutely right to flag that. Storage and transmission infrastructure are crucial bottlenecks. It really comes down to hydrogen's physical properties. It has a very low energy density by volume.
Meaning you need large tanks for the same amount of energy compared to, say, natural gas.
Precisely. And there were compatibility issues with existing pipelines, particularly older steel pipelines, as hydrogen can make the metal brittle over time. That's a major safety and cost concern.
So what's being done about that? What are the solutions?
There are several avenues being pursued. Vital advances are needed in areas like liquid organic hydrogen carriers, or LOHCs.
LOHCs, what are those?
They're basically special liquid compounds that can chemically absorb and release hydrogen. So you transport the liquid, which is much easier than extract the hydrogen at the destination.
Tell her.
It is. Another major pathway is converting the hydrogen into ammonia for transport, as we mentioned, because ammonia is much easier to handle and ship, and there's already a global infrastructure for it.
So using ammonia as the hydrogen carrier?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And on the infrastructure side, India is proactively developing dedicated hydrogen export corridors at strategic ports. Places like Paradip on the east coast, Kandla and Tuticorin on the west. This shows they're thinking about potential export markets too, not just domestic use.
That's forward-looking.
Yeah.
Now, who are the major players? Who is actually shaping this evolving landscape in India? Can you give us a sense of who's doing what?
Sure, we're seeing a really dynamic mix. It includes established industrial giants and also newer, more specialized energy companies. In the upstream segment production and components, you have India's big industrial conglomerates like Reliance Industries. Alongside them, the major state-owned oil and gas companies, IOC, ONGC, BPCL, HPCL, GAL, and the power utility NTPC, they're all investing heavily.
Leveraging their existing energy infrastructure and expertise, presumably.
Absolutely. Then you also have major private industrial groups like JSW Energy, part of JSW Steel, and the Adani Group making significant plays. And then there are dedicated new energy players emerging, like Advait Energy, Wellspun New Energy, Oriana Power. It shows the breadth of interest.
Okay, that's upstream. What about midstream, the transport and storage bit?
For midstream activities, players include names like Adani Energy Solutions. And critically, we're seeing significant joint ventures forming. For example, GIL, the gas utility, is partnering with Cummins Accelera.
Cummins makes engines, right?
Yes, and Accelera is their new power segment focused on zero-emissions tech. They're looking at electrolyzer manufacturing. Another JV is between BPCL, the refiner, and SimCorp from Singapore, focusing on midstream infrastructure for hydrogen and ammonia. These partnerships are key for building out the complex logistics.
And downstream, the end users.
Downstream, where the hydrogen actually gets used, we see many of the same upstream players involved, like IOC, using it in its refineries. Plus, companies like INOX Air Products, a major industrial gas supplier, and importantly, the big steel players, Jindal Stainless Ltd, GSL, JSW Steel again, and Tata Steel. They are actively working on decarbonizing their operations using hydrogen.
So the steel sector is really leaning in.
Definitely. You also see Adani Enterprises involved in applications, a company called MRF, and even Indian Railways is exploring hydrogen fuel cell trains.
Railways, too. Interesting.
It shows the diverse range of potential applications being explored. And those strategic partnerships like BPCL SemCorp or JL Cummins Accelera are really important signals. JL's PE electrolyzer plant project, for instance, signals a serious push towards domestic manufacturing capabilities.
You mentioned electrolyzers rely on imported materials, though. Is that a barrier?
It is a significant point. While India is pushing hard for local production, key electrolyzer technologies like PM proton exchange membrane and SOEC solid oxide electrolyzer cells.
Which are currently among the most efficient options.
Generally, yes. They still rely heavily on imported rare earth metals and catalysts, like platinum and iridium.
Which creates supply chain risks and cost issues.
Exactly. And even emerging technologies like PEC, that's photoelectrochemical, using sunlight directly to split water, they face their own challenges with scalability and material stability. They seem a bit further out commercially.
So overcoming these material constraints and achieving economies of scale in manufacturing
will absolutely require large-scale projects taking off and continued strong government support to incentivize that domestic production ecosystem.
Okay, let's talk numbers again, focusing on the economics. What are the core economic drivers and what ultimately makes these multi-million, even billion-dollar green hydrogen projects commercially viable?
Well, the levelized cost of hydrogen, that LCOH figure, is primarily influenced by two big things. Input energy costs, the cost of the renewable electricity, and the capital expenditure, the upfront cost of building the plant, especially the electrolyzers.
And you said energy is the biggest piece.
By far. Renewable energy cost alone typically accounts for about 2/3, maybe even 70%, of the total green hydrogen production cost.
2/3 just from the electricity.
Yes. Which brings us back to that point. The real key isn't just the electrolyzer tech itself, crucial as it is. It's securing vast amounts of cheap, abundant renewable power. That's the foundation.
And that's where India's solar and wind potential comes in.
Precisely. It's a potential major competitive advantage. So to hit that target LCOH of roughly $2.01 per kilogram by 2030.
What needs to happen on the cost side?
We'll need something like a 35 to 40% reduction in electrolyzer costs from today's levels. We'll also need efficiency improvements in those electrolyzers, maybe 12 to 14% better performance, and, crucially, stable, predictable policy support to give investors confidence.
Are projects becoming viable now, or is it still mostly future potential?
They are starting to become commercially viable, or at least pencil out on paper, especially for those key sectors like steel, ammonia, and potentially long-haul transport, where green hydrogen offers a clear decarbonization route.
But it must be sensitive to costs.
Highly sensitive. Project viability can swing quite dramatically based on the price of electricity, the actual efficiency achieved by the electrolyzers, and any potential carbon price that might emerge.
So government incentives are still important.
Absolutely critical at this stage. Things like waivers on interstate transmission charges for renewable power used for hydrogen production. Those kinds of measures play a really crucial role in making the project economics work right now.
Okay. No emerging sector, especially one this ambitious, is without its hurdles. So as India races towards its green hydrogen goals, what are the key risks and challenges it faces in scaling up? What could derail this?
Absolutely. There are several significant hurdles to navigate. First, you have technology risks. We touched on this, the dependence on costly, sometimes supply-constrained rare earth metals for the leading PM and SOEC electrolyzer technology.
Platinum, iridium.
Exactly. That creates supply chain risks and keeps costs higher than desired. And as we said, newer technologies like PEC still face scalability and material stability challenges. They're not quite ready for prime time at massive scale yet.
Okay, technology risk. What else?
Then there's regulatory and policy uncertainty. While India has shown strong policy direction with the national mission, the ultimate success hinges on sustained and coordinated action over many years. Policy needs to remain supportive and consistent across different government levels and agencies. Any wavering could slow investment.
Makes sense. Consistency is key for long-term bets.
Definitely. Then, related to the tech risk, are broader supply chain vulnerabilities. Heavy dependence on imported materials, not just rare earths, but potentially other key components for electrolyzers or fuel cells, can lead to cost volatility and geopolitical supply risks.
Okay. What about competition?
Right, competition from other low-carbon fuels. Blue hydrogen is often mentioned as an alternative.
Produced from gas with carbon capture.
Yes, but it's important to note that blue hydrogen still carries a potentially substantial climate impact due to fugitive methane emissions leaks during natural gas extraction and transport. Plus, its overall system efficiency tends to be lower than green hydrogen. So while it might be a transitional fuel for some, green hydrogen is generally seen as the preferred long-term solution for deep decarbonization.
Got it. Infrastructure.
Infrastructure bottlenecks remain significant, as we discussed. Hydrogen's low energy density, the compatibility risks with existing steel pipelines, the high energy costs of liquefying hydrogen for transport. These are all major practical hurdles for widespread distribution and use.
And one that seems particularly relevant for India, water.
Yes, water stress. That's a really important one. Electrolysis requires significant amounts of purified water.
About 9–10 liters of water per kilogram of hydrogen, right?
Roughly, yes. And in a country like India, which already faces water scarcity in many regions, sourcing that much purified water sustainably could pose real challenges, especially as production scales up massively. It needs careful planning and potentially integration with desalination or water recycling.
Feels like a crucial practical challenge that needs solving alongside the tech and cost.
It absolutely does. And finally, back to the core issue. High production costs. Even with the projected cost reductions, India's current green hydrogen production cost is estimated to be about 40% higher than the least expensive producers in the G20 today.
40% higher.
Roughly. So substantial cost reductions are still needed not just for domestic adoption, but also if India wants to be a globally competitive exporter of green hydrogen or its derivatives like green ammonia.
You mentioned the target LCOH of $2.01 kilotons by 2030. Now, for our listeners who follow this globally, how does that price point stack up, for instance, against the heavily subsidized hydrogen prices we might see emerging in places like the US with the Inflation Reduction Act or parts of Europe? Is India's pathway uniquely aggressive, or are they strategically learning from these global trends?
That's a great question. India's target price of around $2 kilotrams is indeed aggressive, especially when you consider it aims to achieve this largely through scale, technological improvement, and localization, rather than relying solely on the kind of massive open-ended production tax credits seen in the US IRA, for example.
So less direct subsidy, more focus on fundamental cost reduction.
That appears to be the core strategy, yes. It makes it perhaps a unique and potentially more sustainable long-term play if they can pull it off, as it's less dependent on ongoing, large-scale government subsidy payouts. They are certainly learning from global trends in technology and policy, but the emphasis on domestic capability and fundamental cost drivers seems quite pronounced.
Okay, so despite these numerous challenges, tech risks, policy consistency, supply chains, infrastructure, water, cost, is the sector truly ready for scale up in India?
I would say yes, the sector is definitely poised for a significant scale-up. The momentum is there. It's really driven by that combination of clear government targets, the substantial financial commitments being made, and that steadily increasing industrial demand pull.
So the next decade is critical.
Absolutely. The coming decade represents a crucial window for India, a window to really push hard on indigenizing electrolyzer production, to lock in those vital long-term demand commitments from industry, and to strategically scale up the necessary midstream infrastructure.
And for investors, when might they realistically expect to see returns? Is this a short-term or long-term play?
This is predominantly a long-term play. Investors need patience. Returns are likely to materialize more significantly as cost parity is approached and achieved, likely towards the end of this decade and into the 2030s, and as that supporting infrastructure develops. But substantial growth is certainly expected by 2030 and beyond, assuming the current trajectory holds.
And which types of companies specifically are best positioned to benefit from this scale-up?
Several types.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, electrolyzer OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers. With India's market poised for such significant growth, domestic and international players setting up shop could do well.
Okay.
Secondly, those EPC firms we mentioned, the engineering, procurement, and construction companies, capable of actually designing and building these complex, large-scale green hydrogen projects.
Right, the project implementers.
Exactly. Thirdly, utilities and energy companies. The major state-owned oil and gas firms, the power utilities like NTPC Green Energy, and large private players like Adani Group, Tata Power, they're already investing heavily and have the balance sheets to support large
Makes
projects.
sense. Who else?
Fourth, the industrial end users themselves, particularly in those hard-to-abate sectors. Companies in steel like Jindal Stainless, JSW Steel, Tata Steel, or in fertilizers and chemicals like Coromandel International, Madras Fertilizers, INOX Air Products. Those actively transitioning to use green hydrogen will be part of the core market.
And finally,
Finally, don't forget the infrastructure and logistics companies, those developing innovative solutions for hydrogen pipelines, perhaps advancing those LOHCs, or focusing on ammonia-based transport and storage infrastructure. They play a vital enabling role.
so wrapping this up, our deep dive really reveals a nation fully committed, it seems, to a green hydrogen future. Impressive targets, significant investment underway. But as we've discussed, it's also clearly a journey with very real, substantial challenges to overcome.
Indeed. It's a fascinating picture. India's green hydrogen mission isn't just an economic opportunity, immense as that might be. It's also, in many ways, a grand national experiment. An experiment in balancing cutting-edge technological innovation with pressing environmental sustainability needs, like water management, and also achieving greater geopolitical energy independence. So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to consider is this. How might India's success, or perhaps its struggles, in specific areas like managing water for electrolysis sustainably or securing those critical rare earth metals for electrolyzers, how might that influence the global race towards a hydrogen economy? And ultimately, what ripple effects might that have for energy prices, for industrial competitiveness, and maybe even for you in your daily life down the road? It's a story that's just beginning to unfold.